Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Securing the Future, Zero Trust and Emerging Technologies for the Hybrid Workforce. As remote and hybrid workforces have continued to grow in the last 2 years with the pandemic, so have the challenges surrounding the security of those environments. Government organizations are turning to tactics based on zero trust principles that prioritize permissioned access on a continuous basis and FedRAMP certification to guard network supply chains. We'll try to dig into what the broader future of the hybrid workforce might look like as both the threat landscape and our attitudes toward how to secure against it or given it both evolve. I'm Mariam Bakshan, a staff correspondent on cybersecurity here at NextGov. The experts joining us today, the expert panelists, are Stephen Hernandez, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of Education. He's also co-chair of the CIO Council, and we definitely want to talk to him about that as well. And Dan von Tom, the chief of the Corporate Information Division for the Air Force Research Laboratory, where he's been for more than 20 years. Dan and I are talking for the first time, so just getting through the titles here. The agency's mission there is to develop cutting-edge technologies for the nation's air and space forces in the areas of satellite technology and experiments and directed energy systems that include lasers and high-power microwave systems. Interesting stuff, almost like sci-fi-ish. So what are the challenges around continuing around securing that environment, which should be pretty interesting. So, sirs, thank you for sharing your perspectives with us today. Why don't we start with what zero trust is? I mentioned the supply chain angle through FedRAMP. There's logical separation issues that you might put things like firewalls into. But my understanding is that at the heart, or maybe the forefront of implementing zero trust tactics is this idea of knowing who's asking to get to certain data. I think that's why they call it a data-centric approach. So, Stephen, why don't we start with you? Tell us anything else we need to know about your background, and then confirm or deny whether my description was accurate, and what do you want to add to it?
No, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's always an honor and a pleasure to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is zero trust. And I think that, whether it's at my own department and agency or in my work with the CISO Council, this question comes up a lot. Well, what is it, right? What is it we're shooting for? And I agree with you 100%. You nailed the foundational one-liner. If we had to sum it up in a sentence, it's how are we engaging in the interaction between some type of subject, which is a person, maybe a device, maybe even a bot these days, right? And then some type of object, which is almost always data, but not always. It could also be a device, another person, etc. And then how are we bringing in the element of trust and assurance that one, that connection should be there in the first place, and that two, we're evaluating it in a near real-time basis consistently for changes or for indicators that, you know what, that might not be Stephen coming after that particular security data at this moment, and maybe we ought to adjust it. Where that distills down is a few different planes or dimensions, and the simplest way we can kind of group them is around 4 different areas. We have the data, which we talked about, both what are we protecting, but also what do we have access to in terms of our sensors, our telemetry, what's happening in the world around us. We then have the control plane, which is how well can we effectuate change in our security environment and our systems as things change between that interaction. We have identity, and that's typically identity, credential, and access management. If we can't establish an identity for a subject, frankly, they have no business accessing anything. And that's one of the foundation cornerstones of trust. And then the last piece is what we call the trust engine or the policy engine. And that's where we're bringing in concepts like machine learning, AI, robotic process automation to move at the speed of the machine and start to really leverage a lot of the SOAR capabilities, security orchestration, automation, and response, that, we start with 16 million possible indicators that we need to evaluate, and we distill them down to 80. And those are like some real world numbers that the technology these days can provide. And what I'll kind of close out this thought on is, some folks are saying, well, this is a completely new way of looking at security. And I challenge folks to think of this more like an evolution. And frankly, I do that for two reasons. One, because we are evolving from the boundary-based security models that we've relied on and have been, so venerable in the past. But we also need to adjust to the thinking that this may never actually have an end. As technology continues to evolve, as we get better capabilities across these dimensions, we're going to constantly be moving and adapting and growing to keep up with the world around us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was so great because you brought up a lot of other questions. I definitely want to dig in a little bit to bots, which you mentioned, because that combined with the AI and machine learning and that trust algorithm, right? Zero trust, but then you've got a trust algorithm. So what's in there? So we'll dive into a lot of that stuff. And then, but first, I want to get Dan's take on the same question here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is quite an opportunity to be able to talk to everyone. I don't think you can sum it up any better than what Steve just did. I mean, that was an amazing job for a very complex architecture and concept. One thing I do want to add in for the masses is, you probably, industry has been doing this for quite some time. And people will look at this and say, well, this is not a new capability. It has evolved, as Steve said. But within the government, everybody needs to understand that we've been shut down for so many years, isolating our data, isolating our traffic within our networks, that we've never had to really deal with outside contacts, people coming in from other than on base or at a specific location, hardwired. We're using wireless now. We have the remote technologies, VPNs. So this is really where all the impetus of where at least the Air Force and the research lab comes into understanding zero trust. And really, we're learning from industry because they have been doing it for so long. We're catching up a little bit. We have a good handle on it, but we are driving hard in that direction. And as you mentioned, it stems from what the pandemic caused, in far as remote telework that is not going to stop. And you mentioned also FedRAMP, so cloud hosted enterprises, where it's just it's a little bit more open environment. So we need to learn and adapt and make sure that we're secure as we go forward.
Yeah, you said a lot of magic words there too. VPNs, for example, right? Because we've heard the NSA officials talk about how a lot of this commercial technology, including VPNs, can actually act as vectors if they aren't properly secured. So maybe this is an appropriate time to just dive right in to the FedRAMP question. And this is coming up a lot in just talking about the software supply chain in general. And we've got open source. I wrote down, took interest in the bots mentioned because, they're using this to mine cryptocurrency, or at least setting up those infrastructures, it sounds like. So my question is, considering the ubiquity of open source, reliance on open source specifically, how should FedRAMP change, do you guys think? Steven?
So first I'll say that, Brian and Ashley before him, and even Matt Goodrich before, they just did a tremendous job of getting that program in place. And I always like to remind folks, before FedRAMP was in place, it would take me between 1 and 2 years to fully authorize a cloud environment, to get it authorized under FISMA. At the optimal now with FedRAMP, I can do that same authorization process in a little under 2 weeks. And so, one, I always like to make sure folks recognize the incredible gains that we've already achieved through the FedRAMP program, and then talk a little bit about, where do we have those future opportunities. And I think that with FedRAMP, especially as we look at revision 5 of the 800-53 controls with NIST, we're going to see a lot of things like supply chain become front and center topics for the FedRAMP program, because they necessarily will need to bring them in and make sure that our cloud service providers are addressing them. And when we think about that, especially in terms of things like open source software, we really view that as a trade space. Open source software, I say it's the free puppy, right? It's awesome, it's fun, the price is right most of the time, but you take that puppy home and there's care and feeding that has to happen every day. There's the vet bills, there's the training, right? There's other ways that we have to invest in it, and it's different ways of investing than, say, we might do with a commercial off-the-shelf type software provider. With them, it's easy. You go to them and say, hey, I got a security problem. I need you to address it now. Open source, well, there's a community, right? And you're now a participant in that community. And if you want something done really fast, well, you may end up having to do it yourself. And the question there is, do you have the right resources on hand to be able to do that?
Interesting. So in terms of changing, it sounds like there's a lot to do, but it sounds like what you're saying, just to confirm, is there does need to be more attention on the open source including the open source sort of review and work, securing that into the FedRAMP process.
Yeah, I would say that, overall, I think as FedRAMP tackles supply chain writ large and the controls that are around it, necessarily we're going to see open source be part of that. But it won't be exclusive to open source, because we just take a look back the last few years. We've had commercial off-the-shelf software that had the exact same problems. And so I think writ large on the software supply chain, we're going to see some movement there.
Exactly. Open source is about 80 or 90%, very high percentage of all software anyway, right? Stephen is nodding for the record. Okay, Dan, what are your thoughts on this then?
Well, I'd like to take a little different approach than what Steve did, and once again, phenomenal explanation. But FedRAMP, you're asking what should change in FedRAMP, and he hit it on the head with, yeah. And I think the better question is what are we going to do to catch up to FedRAMP? FedRAMP, it's a phenomenal capability. The design of it, the trust in it, the inheritance of security aspects that we enjoy. As he said, it was 2 years or more to get a cloud instance approved for us to use. And now it's down to 2 weeks, and actually even going down further in some instances where we can be up there in a week using this capability. So one of the larger picture scales of what we were looking at, being R&D, we like to challenge everything, right? So it's not just S&Es doing the physics and the engineering, but the IT folks will challenge everything as well. And the overall Air Force uses the RMF, which is the risk management framework for our accreditation. And what we are trying to do is start to leverage that concept, that capability that FedRAMP has put in place as, hey, this is our boundary, this is our rules. Do you approve of how we do this? Make it more autonomous, so we're spending less time working on the documentation and waiting 6 months, sometimes 8 months to get something accredited, especially with space flights and directed energy weapons. We have to stand up very quickly and stand down. Some things last for 6 weeks, some things last for 3 years. We have to be able to support that from an IT infrastructure. So we need to be faster on the accreditation side, matching what FedRAMP has done, and start discarding with the traditional RMF approach that we've come to.
Interesting. Yeah.
I just want to add one piece to that, if I could, because Dan, you just hit it on the head. How do we move faster with greater trust and assurance in, say, cloud authorization? One of the things we can all participate in and push for is greater adoption of things like OSCAL, the open source control assessment language, where if we can get our GRC tool providers to fully implement and integrate, if we can get our CSPs to do it, wow, we can really start moving at the machine speed if we have the machines talking to each other. So just a point I wanted to throw out there. I never miss a plug for OSCAL. I wanted to make sure we got it in.
Yeah, great point.
You knew exactly where I was going because I wanted to talk about this idea of continuous sort of approval, right? And yeah, so talk a little bit, maybe if you guys aren't, don't mind or have more to say on the importance of SBOM, incorporating SBOMs, which the administration is exploring how they can do that, and the machine readability of that, plus the introduction of OSCAL, or the OSCAL factor in general, and how far out rather, you think we might be from the kind of continuous approval continuous authorization of software and integration into our system.
I actually want to hear Dan's point on this one first.
Okay, yeah, fair. Go for it.
That's funny because I was actually going to defer to you, but let me take it from a higher level because I am not familiar with OSCAL and a lot of those concepts. I'm a little bit higher management kind of stuff. But when you talk about continuous monitoring, and that's what we call it, and it kind of reverts back to the RMF I was just talking about. Is a lot of things that we do is a snapshot in time. Hey, this is what it looks like now. Would you approve it? As long as we continually monitor this and maintain the status that we are showing you we have, it doesn't work well. I mean, the bottom line is it just doesn't work well. It does need to be a autonomous, interactive, continuous monitoring environment. And I mean, it just goes back to, once again, look what FedRAMP has done. Look what the cloud can do. Now, we can't really afford to put everything in the cloud, okay? There's a couple of reasons for that. And I'm going to defer to Steve. Like I said, I just want to throw this in here. Why aren't we just putting everything in cloud and the security will take care of that? Well, it's really expensive. We lose a lot of control over the environment just because, the bandwidth, the traffic, the bottlenecks that occur in place because of our security. A lot of times the speed isn't there. And if, a site goes down somewhere, I mean, we have multiple redundancies, I get that, but sometimes things go down, things go wrong, and we're just sitting here and we can't do anything about it. So I don't see us really ever going 100% into the cloud. I see us using a hybrid type of environment. So we always have some local control, especially over our data and our capabilities. That being said, I got off topic a little bit, so I'm going to revert back to letting Steve, our security expert, talk about the stuff you asked about, Mariam.
No, I actually I'm glad that you raised the question first of cloud versus not cloud, right? Because there are some pros and cons there that I don't know necessarily get discussed enough. But I don't want to introduce my opinion here too much. Steve, why don't you respond?
Yeah, so the SBOM question I definitely appreciate because we're living the dream of not having SBOMs right now with Log4j. In most cases, when we had the vulnerabilities of the past, it was, well, hit the environment with a scanner and you'll know whether you're affected or not. This is much more complicated. I had someone share a great analogy with me yesterday. It's like being told, hey, there's a recall on salt and it could be poisonous, so make sure you deal with it. Well, you grab the salt shakers, you dump them out, and you're like, great, I'm good. And then you start rummaging through your fridge and it's like, well, wait a minute, the pickles have salt. Wait, the salami has salt. Wait, the salad dressing has salt. And all of a sudden things get much more complicated. And that is a great analogy for what we're working through right now with Log4j. Now, the good news is the reason there's salt, to keep the analogy going, is you look at the label, right? The back of the dressing says last ingredient, salt. The software bill of materials, if we can get there, gives us that same type of capability. So we can go through and say, software X, what are all the different pieces, libraries, modules that come together to build this particular thing? And it greatly increases our ability to track things down and understand what our exposure is. One of the biggest challenges is, of course, just the amount of software that's out there and the level of effort to do this. And when we look at the Office of Management and Budget and their memorandum that came out last year, 2130, we're starting to focus on the critical software. What are these pieces of software that, they do have access to the whole environment? They can create administrative access, etc. But then as we look further, it's, how do we start getting things like SBOM from the vendors? And that'll be largely contractual, maybe even, regulatory, depending on how things sort out. And it's going to be those vendors that are willing to play with us in that space. They're going to be the vendors we buy from, just like FedRAMP and cloud. It's like, can you meet FedRAMP? Great. You are a viable contender and competitor for our cloud business.
Right. But that's still a little bit, I'm interested in, I don't want to linger on this too long because I do want to get to the other aspects of FedRAMP or of Zero Trust, and specifically, related to the hybrid situation we find ourselves in. So maybe it's, we ought to spend a little time talking about multi-factor authentication versus something like universal factor authentication, having something physical, and talk about how those technologies and cryptography work, and how are you managing those aspects in your systems given this other factor of continuous monitoring. Hopefully that's not too dense a question. Yeah, and maybe while you're doing that, Stephen, I'll have you transition to just say a thought about cloud versus no cloud, just to not leave that loop open.
Yeah, so we're obviously different mission space. Department of Education, obviously we have 1.6 trillion in accounts receivable, and a few other trillion that we broker every year. We operate a lot like a bank. We also have our core education mission of making sure that children and students everywhere are getting the education that they want, and in many cases are legally entitled to. When you look at our mission space, we discovered almost a decade ago now that all of it can be done in the cloud. And with the exception of a little infrastructure on site for networking and security, 100% of our workloads are in cloud environments. We're actually going through a process of, instead of data center consolidation, we're looking at cloud consolidation. How do we optimize our cloud portfolio now? And so it really is about the fit, though. I used to work a lot in law enforcement, and there are some situations there where no, we're going to have it in a physical data center for a lot of reasons, resilience being one of them. So I totally get where Dan's coming from. A little bit about multi-factor. That's also a very passionate area that the CISO Council, OMB, and all the departments and agencies are working with right now. And it's interesting to see how this has evolved. It used to be that a one-time password or a one-time token was considered one of the gold standards. It's like, if you had that as part of your login, you were doing really well because it would change every single time that you were logging in. But nowadays, that's considered deprecated. When we look at the draft Zero Trust architecture strategy, we see a call out that says verifier impersonation resistant authenticator. And of course, our good friends at NIST, our academics and our researchers, they love to be very specific with their words. What it basically means, though, is it's a phishing resistant authenticator. What we've seen in the wild is attackers can reverse proxy a website, basically bring the website forward on their own equipment or services, and then you put in your username, you put in your password, you put in your one-time token, but then they have control of the session because they've inserted themselves into the middle. And so a big push is to move beyond those type of authenticators to basically where a certificate or a cryptographic element is involved in that authentication, so we can actually ferret out whether there's somebody sitting in the middle of the transaction.
Right. Dan, talk about this a little bit from your perspective, and then we'll go back to talking about the trust algorithms at the center of this.
Yeah, so it is a different mission that we deal with. Writ large, we do, just like you said, the certificate. We have certificates on our machines. We have our common access card with our certificates on them. And so we have something we have something we know. And that's how we access just about everything in our environment. Whether a lot of times even on standalones, we will implement that kind of technology. Back to what we talked about a little bit before with the data and the hybrid, we do have classified projects that we have to deal with, and cloud is getting there to be able to secure that type of environment, that type of data. But we're not there yet. So we do have requirements where we're going to keep a lot of our data local. We can. So when I said before that cloud makes you nervous because of the availability of it. We can't put our infrastructure up there. We're just not ready to do that. There are test cases going on in the Air Force right now where entire bases are in the cloud and testing that capability out and see what it looks like as far as going forward with that. So we're very cognizant and very cautious about how we use our authentication, and multi-factor authentication is usually limited to one type, and that's using our CAC card to access any accounts. Go back to zero trust, constantly asking, constantly checking, hey, are you still that person? Are you still there? It's a hindrance. A lot of times users don't like it because you're entering your PIN number, that thing that every 15 minutes, 30 minutes, depending on what the settings are and the network is. But that's part of the security, and that's part of the job, and that's what we have to do to stay secure.
Gotcha. So yeah, I think you started there, Dan, to talk a little bit about that trust algorithm. So part of it is setting how often, having that kind of control through your trust algorithm. Stephen, talk a little bit about some of the other things that are involved in developing those trust algorithms, and maybe give a little more credence to Dan's sort of concerns and anxiety over a lack of control when you're doing this in the cloud.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the cloud inherently has a control issue. About 98% of the breaches we see in the cloud are poor configuration choices. It's very rare that you actually see something like the cloud hypervisor was compromised, because that's basically game over for a cloud service provider. You might as well just close up shop at that point, because no one will trust you going into the future. But to Dan's point, you have to have a culture, you have to have a team that's ready to operate in that environment. And when you bring all those together, that's a big piece of the information that you're going to use to make the decision as to whether or not the cloud is the right environment for you. And then there's still that level of, there is an abstraction. There's a layer of abstraction where, like in the law enforcement space where we did use the cloud, we encrypted everything before we sent it out, and we held all the keys. And it was somewhat cumbersome and expensive to do that, but in this particular mission it was the right fit. In almost other cases we would have said we can just keep it in our own data center and have our own personnel handle it, and then we can not have to worry about all this other stuff because it's a compensating control. That feeds into the other pieces around like the trust algorithm, because one, we're looking at the user, the identity, who do you claim to be, and what can you assert to prove that you are who you claim to be. But then we're looking at other elements. For example, I want to interrogate the device you're coming in from. And I'm going to figure out really quick, is that a government issued device? If it's a government issued device, the ID checks out, and you're strongly authenticating that you are that identity. That's a pretty high trust score in just very simple terms. I see it's a device that, geez, I've never seen this device in my life, and it's vulnerable. I see it's missing some critical patches, and it's coming from a country that I would not expect this person to come from. All of a sudden, that trust score just starts going down and down and down, even to the point of where it's like, you know what, shut down the connection, notify the SOC, and let's get in contact with this user. Enough things are not adding up that this is problematic. And I think as we go forward in the trust algorithm and we get more data, we're going to bring in things like continuous diagnostics and mitigation data, right? The CDM program, because that's going to tell us a lot about the devices we know, the software, the hardware, in many cases, how ICAM is integrated. But then there can be other elements as well, geolocation information for mobile devices. You want to connect into my system, you're going to give me your location as part of that transaction. And if that location doesn't check out or seem right, well, that's going to get factored in as well. So it's crazy exciting, because the sky in the world is really the limit in terms of data that we can start to factor in as part of the trust decisions.
Yeah, and I hear like, every agency is different. And so this, maybe not every agency, but there are differences in, the types of agencies and their needs and such. But it sounds like it might be valuable to have sort of a checklist that people can go through and say like, well, is this in my trust algorithm? Am I considering this? Maybe another thing to clarify would be to just confirm that it's the CISO who has the responsibility for building these algorithms. Is that correct? And, yeah, like I was asking before, is there somewhere where folks can, CISOs, if those are the people deciding, can sort of check through and say like, what do I want to plug into my algorithm?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I would say that the CISOs are definitely probably the primary stakeholder in most situations. But I think as this grows, we're going to see other stakeholders. We're going to see the counterintelligence folks that will be interested. We're going to see potentially even our risk management organizations at the higher level, not just cyber, but risk management writ large at the organization, interested in what's happening here. So I think that, much like Field of Dreams, you build it, they'll come. In this situation, it's absolutely true. Once folks understand that there's this rich data source available about near real-time behavior and risk in the enterprise, folks are going to want to tap into that.
Everybody's going to want to have a say, right? And I think that's a good way to transition to, sort of that pin in the encryption debate in general, right? End-to-end encryption versus, some people having, like law enforcement having, access to direct communications. Dan, are there things about your agency, your organization, that affect how you think about this in your encryption processes? And answering that question, you can also kind of address how you deal with other encryption quandaries, like if you want control over your data for use in something like machine learning, or whatever processing operation you want to do. How does having your data in the cloud, if you must, affect your ability to do that because it needs to be encrypted by the CSP?
Yeah, so there's a lot of information in that question. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit and keep it to a minimal. So first of all, what Steve was talking about, what you were talking about on the trust algorithm, a lot of the way this is done is at the higher level, whether it be at the Air Force, DISA, DoD, or whatever the case may be in our environment, is they'll create a baseline for you, and that kind of gets flows down. And then depending on your mission, your needs, your requirements, how you operate, where you operate, you add in or take away, and you get somebody's approval to do that. But it's very rare to have a single standard work for everybody. So they recognize that. And so we are giving some latitude in adjusting that. So moving on to the encryption part that you talk about. So encryption, one, encryption is expensive, but that's okay. That's part of our life. But two, there's a huge overhead in encryption. I don't know if everybody recognizes that. When you add encryption to anything you're sending, anything you're working on, it can become, 1.5, 2 times as big, the file size. That decreases your bandwidth, that increases your latency. It affects everything that you are working on, especially in an R&D lab here at AFRL. We can't have that latency and bandwidth when we're doing modeling simulation. So that is a huge aspect of how we evaluate the cryptography that is used in our environments. Within our infrastructure, we don't encrypt, right? We're locked down. We acknowledge the perimeter defense, and we trust that, we understand that it's not 100% there, but we can't have that overhead and still be able to do business every day like we do. We have a lot of soft encryption, something that, we use wireless. We've integrated wireless into our environment as a redundant capability to reach the cloud, to reach our networks when something goes down. So that's encrypted at one level. As we go up the chain, and when you talk about FedRAMP and the cloud services, they have impact levels, 2, 4, 5, 6, anywhere from public information to classified data. We work in all of those realms, and depending on the data that we are using, the data we expect to be in an environment, is how we choose what environment to work on, what encryption we have to use, whether we're using soft encryption, whether we're just using VPN to tunnel the data, which we almost use all the time. I mean, that it's not encryption, but it's a protection of our data, all the way up to, we're working with classified data and we have to use NSA type 1 encryption. That's hardware encryption that has a huge amount of overhead, not only in the amount of data that we have, but also in the management of that, the key mat, and updating all the ComSec equipment with the proper keys to make this work. So, like I said, a huge barrel of information. I'm just grabbing those bits to throw something out there that there is no standard. We evaluate constantly every day. What is this data? How much does it need to be protected? And apply the correct encryption or tunneling that we need to do to go forward.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work and so many things to consider in that risk management calculus. Maybe now is a good opportunity to ask you, Dan, to elaborate a little bit on, your particular really cool sounding environment and some of those operational things that you need to keep doing, and how, your challenges might be a little bit different, or what it takes to secure an environment like that.
Sure, love
It's
to.
left, not left field as in the baseball term, but left of in terms of the heavy research end.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the Air Force Research Lab, it is a unique environment. We do have the NIPR and the SIPR, which is commonly known as the AFNet. Those are the Air Force operational, unclassified and secret networks. But what we do, because of our mission and because of a lot of stuff that we've talked about in the previous half an hour, is we also have a defense research and engineering network. The whole point of this network is for the R&D. It is actually limited on who can get on this network across the board based on your mission. And this is a high bandwidth, low latency network. We accept more risk on this network because we're doing R&D, we're doing MS&A. We have to have the latitude to make mistakes without affecting other people outside. So usually, we have control from our firewall in and what we do. Everything has to be approved. I don't want you to get the idea that we can just do whatever we want. There's a lot of guidelines that we follow, but the same encryption thoughts that we have on the NIPR applied to our DRAN. We have a lot of challenges because our classified data or sensitive data or the work being done, hey, I can't put that software on the DRAN, it's not allowed, which we are fixing very rapidly. So they have individual networks or workstations where then we have to transfer that data from a standalone system onto a network system to get it up so it can be collaborated with. These are just some of the challenges that we face, and it doesn't stop there, because then we got all the experiments that we were working on. So whether it's a satellite, doing some kind of great stuff up there, or a directed energy concept or weapon, we are part of that, and how to protect that from a cybersecurity standpoint, how to secure that communications from space down to the ground, how to secure it from the ground into an MSA facility so that we can manipulate that data, we can test out different theories, we have command and control. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and that's why we have dedicated cybersecurity teams at all of these sites. You have the big picture, but we also have the local picture of teams that address this on a day-to-day basis. And it's a phenomenal capability. But along with that goes a lot of training. We have to maintain that training. A lot of dollars go into, all right, learning more about cloud, learning about basics of satellites. I mean, you're an IT guy, now you have to understand satellites. And so comms and laser comms, I mean, the list goes on and on. It's an amazing place to work. But it's a challenge from an IT perspective to make sure that we can support everybody on this site in two different directives, two different missions, and make sure their data is secure, which they very much care about. You hear a lot that users don't really care. That is absolutely not true here. We're aware of the data that's stolen and what goes on outside of we'll call it an environment. I liken us to an industry sometimes, but the amount of caution that we have to take is always weighed against the mission and the amount of R&D we have to do, and the understanding that we do have to be a little bit higher risk, but make sure not so much that we degrade our capabilities as a nation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question that, Stephen, I would love for you to talk about, with your perspective, you're perched from the council to get a sense of how agencies are dealing with the training challenge, given the heft of everything these implementers have to consider.
So training's an interesting approach in almost all cases, because in a perfect world, the training would be very minimal. And I always liken it to driving an automobile or getting your license, right? The focus is on, do you know how to operate the technology, in this case, the automobile, correctly, and adhere to the laws and the rules of the road. And in a perfect world, that's where cybersecurity training should be at. Do you understand the rules of the road, and can you operate the equipment in a safe and secure manner? Where things start to get really challenging is when the simple choice, the easy choice, the default choice isn't the secure choice, because then we have to rely on the user to make a security decision. And I think the point that you bring up, just so apt right now, is, the human mind, in my opinion, has so many choices it can make in a day. We have so many choices we can make before we get choice apathy and we just stop caring. And it's like, you know what, I just need to get things done. So I'm going to get them done the best way I can. And so part of the training equation, I always explain, is it's also a security engineering and architecture piece, because if we can make it so if you're sending email external, DLP will check for sensitive encrypted things and then say, hey, wait a minute, before the email is even sent, you recognize you got a social security number in here. And if you want to bypass this warning, here's your options. I'm legally allowed to do it, or it's a false positive. And then we have a human check those responses, right? But when we do that, all of a sudden, one, it trains the users in real time. The user did something and then immediately got feedback that, hey, maybe this is a decision you want to reconsider. And then two, it gives us feedback as to how well the systems are working. And when we focus on our training, we try to focus on that delta. Where is the technology not automatically helping train the user and help the user make good decisions? And what are kind of the rules of the road, or how to use the equipment that we need to focus on? And then we also try to make it engaging. Like our last training was an escape room with a Dr. Mysterioso who was attacking the agency. And it kind of had a comic book feel to it, an action hero type of thing. And we got tons of feedback that folks loved it, because it wasn't the same dry, click through the PowerPoint, answer the questions type of thing. And then the last thing I'll end on is reward the folks who actually keep up on this and know what they're doing. One of the first things in the training is you can test out. It's a really hard question set that's really going to determine whether or not you know all the rules of the road and how to operate the car. But if you can do it, you're good. We will accept it and allow you to move on.
Yeah. I love that about Mysterioso. Actually, we'll take this opportunity to show two graphic novels that I have on cybersecurity. It takes a
Fantastic.
village, and this is about vulnerability disclosure, which we didn't, we didn't talk about, but I think that's part of the zero trust conversation. And cyber hero adventures. Okay, no hawking of any no more hawking of books. But let's talk a little bit about a practical question. Let's end on a more practical question, because I think, in terms of the pandemic and people working remotely, there's a big question about bringing your own devices into the situation. Stephen, you mentioned government issued phones, but what's the situation in terms of allowing people to use their own? Dan, pick it up for us.
All right, I can start out with this one. So for us, it's bring your own approved device, not just your own device. There are limitations on what can be used. We actually are kicking off that program. We started kicking off during the pandemic. We had to find a lot of fine tuning to do with that. But basically, if you have a certain phone that's on the list, over at DISA and NIST, NIAP, you can use your phone. And really what we do is we're using those soft certs, the same things that are on our access card. We're putting it on the phone. We're basically partitioning your phone. So part of it is work and part of it is personal. So a big challenge is what CMI is, basically we've had a issue with data flow, right? Some classified data got on an unclassified machine. So a lot of people couldn't do this for a lot of years. We've gotten it down to where you can access a lot of capabilities in the cloud, and the emails and all the other capabilities that we have on your personal phone. And if something of overflow or a spill happens with data, we can just delete that partition on your phone and you're good to go. So we've conquered that problem. Another aspect that we have worked on and come up with is something called ADSV, and I'm not going to tell you what that means because I can't figure it out. But it is a secure laptop, right? So it's really using some virtual capabilities to be able to take a laptop at home or wherever you're going and be able to work on secret level documents and still get your mission done, especially with the telework environment and that kind of thing. That, okay, before you work on classified, you have to come into the lab. You have to come here and work. That is no longer the case. We have finally expanded beyond that. We're catching up with the technology and feeling more comfortable to approve that security type. Technology allows us to do anything. The question is, what are we comfortable with accepting? What risk are we willing to accept? So the GFE that Steve mentioned, that's been a foundation of what we had for years, but that costs money. You're getting a phone from Verizon, you're getting an iPad from Verizon, and now you're carrying a phone that's your personal and a phone that's for work, and you 2 phones on you, 2 iPads, 2 laptops. I mean, it just gets cumbersome by an extreme amount. And so this BYOAD allows us to use one phone, allows us to use our own phone and still get work done, allows us to do the classified on the VDI. And just to jump in there, one more thing, VDI, say virtual desktop infrastructure, that is an amazing capability. And it's taken us so long to get there because of security, because of the requirements that we have. But we VPN from home into our work environment, and we can use VDI to create any instance that is needed. Linux, Red Hat, Windows, connecting to the NIPRNet, connecting to our research and engineering network, connecting to a high-power computer to run some modeling and sim. VDI is the cornerstone of where we're going. It likens the FedRAMP, the cloud solutions, down to a local level. VDI Enterprise is there. Because of the bandwidth, we have a little bit of issues there. It's a challenge, especially with the security that we have to enforce. So VDI down at our data centers allow all of our users to access. It doesn't matter what computer you have at home. You're accessing our network securely, and you're using our resources, our servers, our software to do whatever work you need to do. And that really, to me, from a local standpoint, is a game changer in how we're going to go forward and keep being able to do this intense level work that we do in the IT infrastructure without compromising our data security.
It sounds like Dan is a favorite.
I love it.
But yeah, on that note, I'm getting the signal that we're almost out of time. So that sounded like a plug to me. Stephen, I'll give you a chance to do yours in terms of, the challenge of implementing zero trust, or securing rather the hybrid workforce in general. And then we'll have to say goodbye.
Sure. So I'll be brief because I think Dan just did a tremendously wonderful job of kind of unpacking that discussion space. And I agree with everything he said about the approved devices, BYOD, the VDI opportunity space. All of that is spot on. And I think the one area for us that has been interesting is on the programmatic side, and making sure that we have a forensic ready type of operation, that if we do have a breach, if that breach goes beyond the hypervisor or the virtual container, which is highly unlikely, but if it does happen, folks are aware, we can ask for your personal equipment. And that's been a big area for us to make sure folks understand, because we're commingling your personal and your professional life. That necessarily means things like, if we need to remote wipe your entire device, we are authorized to do that. And so we're pretty clear in the rules of behavior for mobile and BYOD and approved devices that, while rare, and very, very limited in terms of the expectation of this happening. If we need to take control of that device and wholesale wipe it or do something, we will. And for some people, that's been a deal breaker. They've said, you know what, give me the 2 devices, I'm cool with it. Other folks are like, you know what, I back up all my stuff to the iCloud, I could care less, go ahead. So it's been fun to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, I bet. I wouldn't find it fun, but that's why you guys are the heroes, I guess, and not me. With that, I think we have to go, and we didn't even get to some of the other stuff we wanted to talk about. I am really curious about vulnerabilities in the hypervisors or hypervisor products, and maybe that's for another day to talk about how those come full circle with the supply chain issues. Thank you guys both very much, you gentlemen both very much. It has been a pleasure, actually. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in as we kick off our events in 2022. If you enjoyed today's forum, hopefully you did, we hope you share it with your friends and colleagues to keep the conversation going. And for more of what we have lined up, just head over to govexec.com/events. Until next time, for NextGov, I'm Mariam Baksh.
Good afternoon, everyone. A big thanks to our editorial panel for starting that great discussion. My name is Anna Pettyjohn, Senior Vice President of Events here at GovExec, and I'm excited to build on today's topics with a conversation with our event underwriter, Ironbow Technologies. Joining me today, we have Rob Chi, the Technical Director for Ironbow Technologies Cybersecurity Practice, as well as Peter Romness, the Cybersecurity Principal in the Cisco Public Sector CTO Office. Thank you both for joining me today. Let's get started. So to kick us off, what do you think agencies really need to think through in terms of strategy to improve security for a hybrid workforce? Rob, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, one of the big things is just having a good understanding of the users, in the granular access that they need to different applications, and what devices they're coming in on, and what applications they actually need to access. With that, you're able to then take those business requirements and turn those into something that technology can actually complete.
Yeah, and just kind of adding on to that, it's the whole idea of knowing what's going on in your environment and being able to control it. And so just, being able to see what users are in your environment, see what applications are in your environment, and most importantly, what they're doing. It's kind of this situational awareness is a big thing.
Yeah, and then one final thing on that is also like technology can't solve all the problems when you're coming up with a strategy. A lot of it is like the users and having them understand what the technology is actually trying to do. So the old concept of security awareness program and really tailoring that towards a hybrid workforce strategy makes a lot of sense in order to make sure that they understand what is actually needs to be protected and how they can contribute to making sure that they're a part of that security solution.
Yeah, for folks like Rob and I, people always think we think only about technology, but it's people, process, and policy are usually, they're always important parts. Oftentimes, they're the hardest part to take care of.
Great. And to actually dive in a little bit more to the technology piece, and I'm sure we'll touch on the people as well here, but what recommendations do you really have for customers looking to implement important tools for their hybrid workforces like Zero Trust, multi-factor authentication, and others? Peter, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple recommendations on that, actually. The first is I touched on this earlier, but you need to know what's going on. So it's some of the steps that you see, and the federal government CDM program had a great example of this. They had phases. First was what's on the network, first was who's on the network. Secondly, what's on the network. Third, what's going on in your network, and fourth, how do I protect the network from from everything going on. So kind of having this idea, this awareness of where you are now is important. And then coming up with an ideal end state for your agency. And then you develop a plan in between there. And that's kind of the general guidelines. Though one thing that I've seen is oftentimes very successful is to look for a quick return on your investment, look for some things that you can do that give you fast satisfaction. So maybe some kind of cloud application that allows you to get a lot of security benefit for a little less effort put in. Things like DNS security is a big thing that can get rid of a lot of the threats very quickly. Multi-factor authentication takes care of a lot of threats, and they're usually fairly easy to implement. And so your team gets a victory and your people see the benefit very quickly. And it's kind of a shot in the arm for the security organization to have an early success. So that, that's one of the things that I love to see.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And then the fact that the one thing is like the prioritization, looking for the easy wins, but also looking at what needs to be prioritized as far as like, what are the crown jewels that you're trying to protect and what security needs to be wrapped around that maybe is a gap in your security policy right now. So multi-factor authentication is always going to be your low-hanging fruit, like Peter brought up. But I mean, looking at it from the perspective of there may be tools within the security infrastructure today that really maybe lend themselves towards automation or a zero trust architecture. And being able to identify those tools that can be part of your long-term roadmap towards like a zero trust journey, but then also looking at where do you need to fill some gaps that exist to raise the security posture towards protecting those crown jewels or those most sensitive applications or data. And with that, not only do you have to put those into place, but the visibility into making sure and the continuous monitoring associated with making sure that the security applications that you're putting in place are actually doing their job is very important as well.
Yeah.
Great point.
So, kind of summarize, it's have a plan, start with the end in mind, and move forward in steps, right? That's how you do almost any process, and it applies very much to here.
Yeah, that's great. So at the end of the editorial panel, our speakers touched on one of the big challenges presented by a hybrid workforce, and that's the introduction of personal devices used for work, whether that's a laptop, personal cell phone, or even an in-home router. What are some of the challenges around securing these devices? Rob, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Yeah, so when you're looking at some of the personal devices being used, there's a lot of guidance out there, and some of the best from like a home user perspective is going to come from like the federal government. So one great place to look as far as like general guidance is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. The guidance that they have for ransomware, as well as just general good security practices that can be used for enterprises as well as home users, is very, very good. In addition to that, I mean, you look at the vendors that are trying to attract the enterprise market, they also have very good guidance that is going to also pertain to home users with personal devices as well. And in many cases, they have offerings that are paid for offerings that are provided for enterprises, but then they also have either free or much lower cost offerings that are being provided for home users.
Yeah, and the federal government has put out lots of guidance on this lately, and the one thing that they're recommending is the principles of zero trust. And when you start talking about users at home, users all around the world, your data in clouds everywhere and trying to manage it, zero trust does make sense. And so adapting some of these zero trust principles is a good way to go. And, for most federal agencies, it's becoming required. So people need to start thinking about zero trust, and it applies very well to protecting your assets in your organization as people are remote.
Yeah, and just reminded me of like a coworker I was just on a conference call with that was showing me like he had a personal firewall that when you looked at it and the features that it provided, very, very user friendly and almost looked like an enterprise product. So even though, I mean, when you're looking at like a in-home router, you're looking at something that is not necessarily very low on the capabilities to provide visibility and be able to lock down what users can access, but they're really taking the home user market and actually extending that to provide a lot of enterprise features in a user-friendly way. The only other thing was like really outside of appliances and devices, from just a home perspective, and the fact that, you know, there's the merging of your work and your home life, just really the guidance to look at your social media security settings and making sure that those are not oversharing as well.
Great, thank you both for answering that. And just to follow up, how do you work with teams to ensure they're staying safe and secure in the work they do at home? Are there any tools or training or best practices that you'd recommend? Peter, let's start with you.
Well, there is Zero Trust, but there's also this idea of being able to see what's going on in your environment. And I touched on this earlier also. When users are working from home, or really working from anywhere at this point, there are a lot of ways that the bad guys, the threat actors, are aiming to get your valuable data. And so you need to be able to see, who's logging on to what. You need to be able to control who they are based upon your organization's risk tolerance. And you need to be able to allow access really just to the things that they need to get their job done when it's your data. You also, you have to be able to see what's going on and allow them to go to the internet in a safe way. And so it's a matter of, this whole idea of visibility and control. And that's where it comes down to almost every time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The visibility is key, not only just from a general visibility, but also from a threat visibility, bringing in threat intelligence and applying that to the visibility that you're seeing, and to be able to take that needle from the haystack and be able to identify threats based on the visibility, the raw data basically that's being provided. Also, just looking at tools that are available on the marketplace to simulate different types of attacks and making sure that through the visibility that you're being provided, that you're actually seeing that threats are potential threats, simulated attack threats through some of these breach and attack simulation tools are actually being identified and hopefully blocked as well.
Great. And the panel also mentioned that the biggest cloud security risk tends to come from poor configuration choices rather than the cloud itself. What would you recommend to organizations so that they can make better choices to ensure a secure configuration? Rob, let's start with you there.
Yeah, I would just continue on with that, the concept that I brought up earlier with the breach and attack simulation, being able to have the ability to not bring in a penetration testing tool or penetration tester and have them do a one-time test once a quarter, once a year, but instead have a tool that allows you to do a lot of that type of testing and iterate through first, maybe looking at the tactics, techniques, and procedures being used by attackers, really tied to what a lot of vendors are using from a MITRE attack framework to have a standard for identifying different attacks, and then from there being able to launch those attacks in a safe manner and be able to see whether those attacks actually work. And if they do, that allows you to modify your security controls, and then from there be able to then run that simulated attack again, and hopefully this time see that that attack is actually blocked.
Yeah, and the whole idea of configuration, and there's an ability to control what your end user devices are capable of doing, and so if your users are using a cloud-based application, you should still be able to have a visibility of their machine and of where they are going, and be able to control that. And you should be able to, have, if they're going to one cloud application, you can apply one set of rules. If they're going to another cloud application that you may deem to be less secure or have other characteristics, you could change the way that connection is made. And so just having that ability to control it is a big way to help you meet the risk-based goals of your organization.
Great. Well, that was a great note to end on. And unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Rob and Peter, for joining me for this discussion and kind of closing out this great conversation today.
Welcome.
All right, thank you.
And thank you to Ironbow Technologies for their support of this event and making it happen. A big thanks to our audience for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.